Welcome to Chapter 13.2, The Renaissance in the North. By the 1400s, Northern Europe began to enjoy the economic growth needed to develop its own Renaissance. An astounding invention, the printing press, helped to spread Renaissance ideas. In about 1455, Johann Gutenberg printed the first complete edition of the Bible using the new printing press. The printing press caused a printing revolution. Before, books were made by hand. They were rare and expensive, but printed books were cheaper and they were much easier to produce. Now more books became available, and so people began to learn to read. Printed books exposed Europeans to new ideas and new places. The Northern Renaissance began in the prosperous cities of Flanders, which was a thriving center of trade in the Netherlands. Flemish painters pursued realism in their artwork. One of the most important Flemish painters was Jan van Eyck. He portrayed townspeople and religious scenes in rich detail. Peter Bruegel used vibrant colors in his portraitures and lively scenes of peasants. Peter Paul Rubens blended the traditional Flemish realism with themes of mythology, the Bible, and history. German painter Albrecht Dürer traveled to Italy to study the techniques of the Italian masters, and he soon became a pioneer in spreading Renaissance ideas to Northern Europe. Dürer applied the painting techniques he learned in Italy to engraving. Many of his engravings and paintings portrayed the theme of religious upheaval. Northern European humanists and writers also helped spread Renaissance ideas. The Dutch priest and humanist Desiderius Erasmus called for a transition of the Bible into the vernacular so that it could be read by a wider audience. The English humanist Sir Thomas More called for social reform in the form of a utopian or ideal society in which people live together in peace and harmony. The towering figure of the Renaissance literature, however, was the English poet and playwright William Shakespeare. His 37 plays are still performed around the world. Shakespeare's genius was in expressing universal themes such as the complexity and individual in everyday realistic settings. He used language that people understand and enjoy. Shakespeare's love of words also enriched the English language with 1,700 new words. Around 1455, probably through the combined efforts of three men, Johann Gutenberg, Johann Faust, and Peter Schoeffer, all experimenting in the city of Mainz, came up with the idea of movable type, which was actually an adaptation from an earlier Chinese invention of movable type. Europe had probably already seen printed paper money from China, and also probably playing cards that had been printed also in China. But the Europeans were the first to adapt it to the European languages. The way that they made this was to create small letters that were the mirror image of the actual letter, so that when they printed it on a piece of paper, it would show up in the right, pointing in the right direction. And then they would create words with these letters that they could rearrange to form new words, and so they would be able to create pieces of art, literature or writing that would then be able to be disseminated to other parts of Europe. And by the middle of the 15th century, paper also was becoming more available in Europe. You have to remember that you can't, just having movable type would not have made the difference, but their adaptation of Chinese paper also made printing more available to everyone. A paper probably came up through the Muslim Empire and through Spain, and Europeans quickly learned that this kind of paper was far less expensive than vellum, which is calfskin that has been made into for writing, or parchment, which is sheepskin. Within a half a century of Gutenberg's Bible, which was printed in 1456, movable type had really created huge changes in European culture. Printing also stimulated more literacy among lay people. Before this, very few people knew how to read, but as printing material became more available, people began to desire to learn how to read. The Renaissance in the north began in the cities of Flanders, which was a very wealthy area of the Netherlands, or just below the Netherlands. And from this area, these ideas and styles of painting spread to Spain and France and England, and many painters focused on the common people, creating scenes from everyday life. And the writers of this time period also focused on the common man. One of the distinct characteristics of Northern Renaissance painters, or Flemish painters, was their eye for detail. They focused on realism in their artwork, and new oil paints were being made using linseed or walnut or poppy seed oil. These colors caused the colors to become to stay vibrant longer, to reflect the light, and to add depth and a glow to the pictures that they were used in. In the 1400s, the paintings of Van Eyck were filled with realistic and rich detail. Peter Bruegel was another Flemish painter who used vibrant colors to portray scenes from peasant life. But Albert Dürer, who was mentioned in the previous section, was the one who applied Renaissance painting techniques to engraving. Dürer is called the Leonardo of the North because of his varied interest and his varied interests, making him a Renaissance man, and his role in spreading Renaissance ideas in Germany and in other places in Northern Europe. Peter Paul Rubens was another Flemish painter who blended realism with classical themes. And so his paintings have a very strong humanistic theme to them. So his paintings often have stories from classical mythology and history. Albert Dürer was a German painter, but he also did engraving and printmaking, and he was a mathematician. And for all of these things, he was considered to be a polymath, or a Renaissance man, somebody who was good at in many different fields. Because of his high-quality woodcuts, he established a reputation all over Europe, and while he was still in his 20s. So he has kind of been regarded as the Leonardo da Vinci of the North. Northern humanists interpreted Italian ideas about classical antiquity and individualism and humanism in terms of their own traditions and culture. Northern Europe was much more distinctly Christian than Southern Europe, and so the Christian humanists in Northern Europe were interested in developing ethical ways of life, and so they would write about this moral behavior much more than Southern Europe. And so to achieve their goal of creating more moral society, they believed that the best elements of the classical world and Christian culture could be combined together, which was somewhat of a medieval idea, in order to create an exemplary society. Things that they valued were calmness and stoic patience of trials and a broad-mindedness of differences between peoples. They wanted to join human conduct with those Christian virtues like love and faith and hope. Northern humanists also stressed the use of reason rather than accepting just whatever the church taught, which is also called dogma, as the foundation for their ethical way of life. They believed that man should use his reason. They had a profound faith in the power of human intelligence, and that was probably, that individualism spurred on their desire for learning and for making a better society. One of the most profoundly influential men was a man named Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was a Dutch humanist from Rotterdam, and he was born in 1466, possibly, we don't really know, but he died in 1536. He was orphaned at a young age, and he was forced to enter into a monastery, and that's where he got his very good education. He was very good at learning languages, and so he learned Greek and Latin. He used his learning to study the Bible, and this became one of his life's works. As he became a more mature scholar with an international reputation, he was able to boast that, quote, "I brought it about that humanism, which among the Italians savored nothing but pure paganism, began nobly to celebrate Christ." So he saw his life's work as bringing human reason into the teachings of Christ and to illuminate the Bible. And so when you look at his life's work, it is mainly related to translating the Bible and making it much more available and understandable to common man or to people. He wrote other books, though, and one of his most famous books is a book by the name of The Praise of Folly, which he wrote in 1509, and it's basically a satire of worldly wisdom, and it's a call for people to become more simple and more spontaneously Christian, to have a faith that's based on relationship with Christ, and the importance of studying the Bible for oneself. So you can see the overtones of the Protestant Reformation, and which had not happened at this point, but is simmering in the background and is going to break forth in just a few years after this. The Englishman, Thomas More, was a man who was trained as a lawyer. He came from a poor family, but he was trained in a Carthusian monastery to be a lawyer. But he did not join the monastery, and instead he got married, and his household was a model of Christian family life. Under Henry VIII, he served as an ambassador to Flanders, and while he was there, he found the time to write his most important piece of literature called Utopia in 1516. Utopia literally means in Latin nowhere, and it describes the ideal socialistic community on an island somewhere off the mainland of the New World, and all its children receive a good education in Roman and Greek classics. Their learning didn't stop when they had grown up, and as adults, their days were divided equally between half manual labor or some kind of money-making thing, and then the other half was focused on intellectual pursuits. This half day of working and half day of study would then bring about whatever they created. They contributed to the social whole, and they each got what they needed for survival and for happiness. So this island of Utopia was based on a socialistic ideal. What More really meant by this was to suggest that the basic problems in society were caused by greed, and he wanted to try to root out that greed by creating a more equal society where not only mental acuity or access to education was equal, but also access to physical goods was also equal. And he felt like this would be a solution to the problems of the world. Thomas More later had a great role in the Reformation in England. He opposed Henry VIII's move to separate with the Catholic Church, and he actually was put to death. He was beheaded because of his views. Another interesting French humanist was named François Rabelais, who lived in 1490 to 1553. And he was not a Christian, or he didn't write as a Christian, but his works are very secular. But they were very popular during his lifetime, and somewhat even today. One of his most well-known pieces is a book named Gargantua and Pantagruel, which was a story of two likable giants who roam around and have adventures. So you can some scholars read this piece with multiple layers of meaning, but it on the surface is a very comic romance about the adventures of Gargantua and his son Pantagruel. It's a kind of a satire of French society, and it promotes the idea of an education system that's promoted by the government. And on the travels, Gargantua meets various characters, and their exchanges or their conversations occur to have serious discussions about religion, politics, philosophy, education. He's basically trying to point fingers at things in French society that he feels are have a lot of irony or are wrong or mistaken. But he's using humor to try to bring those ideas out and to change his audience's perspective. Rabelais is extremely classic in his humanism because he believes that man is basically good, and that if man follows his instincts, that he will do good and he will do well. William Shakespeare, is probably one of the most well-known Renaissance writers, although he came along later than the early Southern European Renaissance. So he is at the end of the Renaissance time period. But his works are so profound that they have influenced generations after him. William Shakespeare was the son of a successful glove manufacturer. He was born in 1564 and he lived until 1616. He was from the town of Stratford-on-Avon. Avon is the river that goes by Stratford. In 1592, he gained recognition as an actor and a playwright in London, and he became co-owner of a Globe Theatre. And in this theater, he had many plays performed that he actually wrote. His plays are so genius because they understand human psychology. Shakespeare was a true Renaissance man. He grappled with morality and with the deep psychological issues of human nature. He wrote all about history. His plays often have our characters and situations that happened in real history. Some of these examples of his plays would be Julius Caesar, Pericles, Antony and Cleopatra, Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV. All of these were plays that had real historic significance. There were other plays, though, that were fictitious characters that he had created, but they explore the problems of that humans faced. Some of these examples of these plays would be Othello, or Macbeth, or Hamlet. Shakespeare analyzed the psychology of sin, and in the soliloquy that was given by Hamlet, which debates suicide, It is very eloquent about the struggle within human nature to discern what is right and wrong. So this is a famous speech that was given by Hamlet. Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them? This question of what is man to do with problems has been echoed throughout the centuries, and this is one reason why Shakespeare's plays are so profound and popular even today. It's because his questions and his thoughts ring true to man even today.